Good morning, Ms. Caffrey.
Morning, sir.
You're going to be asked questions by Ms. Graham. Before that, would you say the words of the affirmation after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Ms.
Good
Caffrey.
morning.
You are Joanne Caffrey,
Yes, that's correct.
and essentially you've been asked to prepare a report on behalf of the inquiry.
Yes.
And all of your details, contact details and such like are available within the content
Yes.
of that. I won't go into those in any detail. Could we begin just by looking at that report, please? It's SBPI 00181. Now, this will come up on the screen, but you also have a full hard copy in the
Yes.
folder in front of you. I don't intend to take you through the entire report page by page today, but if at any time you feel there's something within your report that you would like to refer to, please don't hesitate to let me know.
Okay.
And we can have that brought up on the screen if that's necessary at any point.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And it's a lengthy report and contains a number of appendices with documents attached and your full CV and
Yes.
such like. So we see from page 1, it says Joanne Caffrey, expert witness, and it relates to Mr. Bio. And if we can move up slightly, it relates to the events on the 3rd of May 2015. And the date of this report is the 31st of October 2022.
Yes.
And then we see just below that, we can move up the screen slightly, it says it's prepared at the request of the public inquiry into the death of Sheku Bio, and there's a caveat there. And that says the opinions expressed in the following chapters are based on the evidence and information available to me as at the date of this report. Should further relevant evidence or information become available, I may require to reconsider my opinions.
Yes.
And so this document was prepared by you on the 31st of October
Yes.
on the basis of information you had up to that date.
Yes, that's correct.
But and this report, does it express your views on these matters as at that date, and it's an accurate representation of the views that you formed looking at various items of information and things you'd been provided with by the inquiry?
Yes, that's correct.
You, in order to prepare this report, were you also sent a number of other documents? Let's look briefly at SBPI 00167. And this, we can just scroll through that. This is an appendix which is an inventory of the disclosed evidence, so evidence that you were given by the inquiry to consider as part of your reflections
Yes.
on the case. And it contained links to evidence that had been heard in our first hearing, statements, PERC statements, inquiry statements, and a number of other documents that are all listed there.
Yes.
I know we're going through this very quickly, but I understand you've seen this
Yes, I have.
before.
Yes.
And then, in addition, after you were sent all of those documents, were you sent a further inventory, which was SBPI 00178. And this is additionally disclosed documents, and it contained training logs, storm logs, transcripts of emergency calls, statements from a Scott Masterton, and then other papers.
Yes.
Thank you. And just to be clear, all of the documents that are listed in the inventory and the supplementary inventory were available to you prior to completing your report on the 31st of October.
Yes, that's correct.
Thanks. Then after you completed your report in October, Were you also sent further documents by the inquiry team in order to update you on information that was becoming available to the inquiry
Yes,
after
that's correct.
you'd finished? And let me just look for a moment at there was supplementary statements that were sent to you that contained statements from an Inspector K,
Yes.
an Inspector Stewart.
Yes.
There was statements from Mr. Masterton,
Yes.
Michelle Hutchison,
Yes.
Sergeant Bissett,
Yes.
Sergeant Dalgleish,
Yes.
and a Miss Anthony.
Yes.
And then you were sent an inspector's job profile and a contact management SOP.
Yes.
And you were also sent a report from Mr. Martin Graves.
Yes.
And you hadn't seen that report prior to completing your
No.
own. Thank you. But you have seen it since
Yes, I have.
subsequently. And have you also seen statements from a Mr. P.C. Wood, who was the dog handler?
Yes.
And you were sent an up-to-date position statement from Police Scotland.
Yes.
Have I missed anything out?
No, I don't think so.
And then since the start of this hearing, were you also asked to view the evidence that was being led last week?
Yes. I've watched the evidence.
So that included oral evidence from Inspector Kay and Inspector Stewart,
Yes.
Martin Graves.
Yes.
He spanned into Monday.
Yes.
And Gary Wood as well, the dog
Yes.
handler. Lovely. I'd like to begin. Is there anything we've not sent you, first of all, that we should have, that you would have expected to see that was missing?
Nothing that comes to mind.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by looking at your CV.
Yes.
Now, the Chair will have your full report available to him to consider at length, but I'd like to just touch
Okay.
on some of your experience. Could we begin by looking at pages 18 of your report? And I think from pages 18 to 27, you actually set out your own background. And you also say at this section, your full CV is at Appendix N of this report.
Yes.
So in the report, we see from pages 18 to 27 a summary of your background, plus that's supplemented
Yes.
by the full CV
Yes.
attached. Going through some of your experience, am I right in saying you were a police officer for almost 24 years?
Yes, 23 and a half.
23 and a half. And you became a police officer in 1990?
Yes, February of 1990.
And that was with the Cumbria
Yes.
Constabulary?
Yes.
And then from 96 to 2003, you were a sergeant.
Yes.
Tell us a little about that.
So in 1996, I was an acting sergeant. And as the acting sergeant in a small town called Penrith, I would change between operational on the street and the custody function. Then in 1997, I was promoted to full-time sergeant, and my first posting was to the custody unit in Kendal. So then between 1997 and 2003, there were no set time periods for doing the different roles. I'd be in and out and flexible between the roles. So I was custody sergeant for anything between 3 months or 18 months at a time. Patrol sergeant, which again would be anything between 3 months and a year at a time. And I was also a PSU sergeant. The PSU, Police Support Unit, or it was commonly called Task Force in those days. I'd be used either for pre-planned events such as at Sellafield Nuclear Establishment for planned protests, or when the PSU full-time sergeant did acting rank roles, I would then cover for his absence. So I know at one point I did his role. I think it was for 3 months, but it may have been 2, but it was somewhere between the 8 and 12 weeks that I covered on a full-time basis there.
And when you say you were a patrol sergeant, what does that mean?
So the patrol sergeant's responsible for the briefing of the shift, all officers on duty, deployment, attending the incidents with the officers. So it's all the day-to-day risk assessment, the deployment plans, the liaison then with the local inspector. So just dealing with the personal and the priorities.
And then you were a sergeant or acting sergeant initially for a year, and then...
Well, the acting sergeant was just for part of that. I think that was a 3 months acting at the end of 1996.
Oh, sorry.
Then it was into 1997 when I was promoted full-time.
So from 97 to 2003, you were a full-time sergeant,
Yes.
carrying out different roles depending on where you were
Yes.
sent. And after 2003, so moving into 2004, what were you doing at that stage?
Then I was deployed into the training department for the force, and I was initially involved in the design of the professionalising investigation programme. And then after the design and delivery of that for a couple of years, I then took over as head of specialist training, which was in relation to the primary roles was custody training, all of the use of force and first aid. They were the 3 core subjects.
And you were the head of that department?
Of that team, yes.
Team. And how long did you do that role, the training role?
Until 2008, when I then went to a newly created role it was called Civil Contingencies and Emergency Planning, but it was in light of all the new command and control documentations and processes that were coming in.
Tell us about that role.
Because it was a newly created team and a new role, the head of the team was Chief Inspector, and because Chief Inspector is one of the gold level ranks, and he was looking for a second in command, which could have either been an inspector or a sergeant, but he was more focused on the skill set that person was going to bring to the role rather than rank specific. They were looking then for creation of training materials, delivery of training to increase the force's preparedness for major incidents and general business as usual command and control functions. We were also going to be working with the multi-agency partners at gold, silver and bronze levels, so there was also going to be a combined training role in relation to the multi-agency working for major and emergency incidents.
Right, can I just ask you 1 or 2 more questions
Yes.
about that? You've said business as usual for the command and control functions. What does that mean?
Because day in, day out, there's always a command and control function. So, for example, the area control rooms is a 24/7 instantly available tactical command, silver command. So that is your business as usual command and control function in place. But then for emergency incidents, of major incidents, unusual incidents, pre-planned incidents with potential, you would then have an established gold, silver and command unit working alongside of the daily business as well.
Would you be able to explain briefly about this gold, silver command?
Yes. So gold, silver and command is the very core of what command and control's about. And how I used to explain it, when I was delivering training to the multi-agencies and trying to bring them into understanding what it's about, rather than keep it police orientated, I would take it to a scenario of getting a fitted kitchen. That the gold command would be the client who wants the kitchen, and they would set the parameters. So they would say the parameter is the maximum budget. They would say roughly what colour they wanted, how many hobs they wanted. So they would give the basic parameters.
And that would be the gold level?
That would be the gold level. Then at silver, that's your tactical plan. So that would be the kitchen designer who would then come up with the plan and agree that that fit then within the gold strategy. So then once that was agreed, at bronze level, you're looking at that's your team of fitters and joiners who will get the plan from the silver, and they would have to then try and make that plan fit. So they would have minor deviations within that. For example, if they then realised there was an extra 6 foot of plumbing that needed put in, that would be within their parameters, as long as it then didn't go out of the budget. But other than that, if there was any significant tactical change, they would have to go back to the silver for agreement of variation of the tactical plan.
So that's how the gold, silver and bronze command would fit together.
Yes.
But with the ultimate goal of securing a kitchen, in your
Yes.
analogy.
Yes.
And there are different levels that each role is distinct. but
Yes,
they
and
work
different
together.
parameters whereby they've got flexibility within those parameters, but if it's going to go outside of those parameters, it needs to feed back up. So if at that bottom level there was going to be some additional cost or time, they would have to feed that back to tactical, who would then maybe need to go back to gold to seek consent and permission for the extra expense.
So there's liaison between each of
Yes.
them as well. So you've said that you were doing the emergency planning at 2008.
Yes.
Did you have special training in relation to
Yes,
that role?
my initial training was delivered by the Cabinet Office at the Emergency Planning College.
Right. And how long did you perform that role?
It was 5 years in total, from 2008 to 2013.
And can you tell us a little about the nature of that role when you were doing it?
So it had functions in relation to day-to-day business, so planning-wise and preparedness-wise, but then it also had the training function in order to increase the force preparedness. So that involved trying to teach as many people throughout the entire force, from constable and civilian equivalent to chief constable, through simulated exercises and scenarios. But then it also meant in real events, we would act as advisors to Gold, Silver and Bronze Command. So at real events, the Chief Inspector, he would be the advisor to the Police Gold Command team. If it was a multi-agency Gold Command team, I would then act as the advisor to the multi-agency Gold Command. But I'd also then be liaising with the tactical commander, so the area control room inspector. If it was a police-only incident, the Chief Inspector would take the police gold, I would take the silver as an advisor, and then the constables and civilians that I had within my team, they would act as bronze command or additional support within the gold and silver function.
So you were part of the emergency planning. Was it a unit? Was that what?
It
or
was a
department?
unit, yes.
A unit.
Yes.
And you would be treated as a source of advice by
Yes.
others performing the role.
Yes, which would often mean call out through the night, even sometimes just being contacted by the control room for verbal advice over the phone in relation to maybe plans that we had, or what should they do, or how to establish, do the need, for example, to set up a separate command and control structure.
So as advisors, I think you said the head of that unit was the Chief Inspector?
Yes,
And you were his deputy?
yes,
And you would sit as advisors next to an ongoing gold-silver command situation on the
Yes.
ground, and you would also assist third parties.
yes. So the design of the building, the control room, my office, which I shared with the Chief Inspector, was as soon as you came out of the control room, our office was the first office that you came to. And then next to us then was my team. And then we had a command suite next to that, which was a large room, large table. But then we also had plans for all of the entire floor of that building to be evicted on immediate notice, so that we could open all those rooms up as for multi-agencies use for any major events.
What's a multi-agency?
So we're obligated, under the UK requirements, we're obligated to have multi-agency response plans for any major incidents. So all your Category 1 responders, such as police, fire, the ambulance service, the health authorities, and then you'd have the likes of the health and safety executive. There could end up being, I know on average, if we brought all of the teams out, we could easily have 100 people across that corridor. Of various different roles, and those roles would depend on what the nature of the event was. Mm-hmm. So the biggest incident we had was severe weather, where we had vital supplies such as gas, electricity, all disconnected through bridges collapsing. So we had a lot of the utility agencies there as well, so their chief executives acting as Gold Command. And then we would have multi-agency Gold Command meetings in addition to police Gold Command meetings, and multi-agency Silver meetings in addition to police-only meetings.
And you were part of the unit advising those
yes. So I would act as the advisor for the Silver Command, which would usually be led by the control room inspector or their additional one that was brought in. If it was decided we needed a permanent inspector on that role, there would be another control room inspector brought out, because they have the most training in relation to other inspectors for command and control.
So in terms of understanding where your role as an advisor fitted in, you would be advising the inspector level, which was viewed as a Silver Command position.
Yes, so although I could advise at Gold, and I did on several occasions, predominantly my role was to advise at the Silver Command, which was the control room inspector.
And your senior officer, the chief inspector, who's the head of that emergency
yes.
planning unit, he would, if he was present and available, he would be advising the Gold Command, which would be another chief inspector somewhere perhaps.
Or the chief officer team, such as chief constable, deputy or assistant. But until he got there, because I lived closer, so I could be there within about 10 minutes. He was typically there within about 40 minutes. So often initially, if it was a call out through the night, I would be with Gold until he came, and then I would go to Silver.
And you did that role for 5 years, did you
yes.
say? And did you deal with a number of major incidents?
Absolutely, yeah, of varying degrees. Those firearms, those severe weather, those bus collisions where children, school bus, all children, 2 children die.
So any major incident?
Any major incident or unusual incident, because the theory would be you've got business as usual, and at the other extreme you've got your major incident, but then in between, otherwise you've got this void of one way or the other. There would be called an unusual incident, and an unusual incident would be one where you maybe not got enough information to put it to a major, but it's beyond the normal run-of-the-mill day-to-day business as usual, and that might either be because of the level of risk or because of the implications with it, or it's using more additional staff than you might have, or you might need the assistance of another agency being involved. So it might be that you're needing to call on the ambulance crew, for example, as support, and asking them to do something that isn't business as usual.
And can you help the chair understand by use of an example of what an unusual incident would be?
So an unusual incident, if for example the police suspected something, so they suspect a firearms incident, one of the initial considerations at a suspected firearms incident is to consider ambulance attendants to be on standby. So if you're then seeking for the ambulance crew, because you haven't got this incident declared as a firearms, it's declared as a suspected firearms, you're then asking the ambulance crew to go outside of their business as usual to deploy an ambulance to then sit at a location in case they're needed. So that would be definitely an unusual incident, because we're doing things slightly different. or it could be that we've reached capacity in a custody unit. So operational capacity is now affected because we can no longer accept any detainees at that custody unit, or because of the level of risk of a small number of detainees or one detainee, they're having to close the custody unit to everybody. So that would become unusual, because then strategies would have to be designed for, is there issued an instruction about detention, or are they going to then install processes to move detainees from one location to 2 hours away?
Right. And then business as usual, would your unit have any involvement in that?
No.
No. Thank you. And then in 2013, am I right in saying you left
Yes.
the police service in order to, and then you trained and became a skilled witness, and you've given a number of reports
Yes.
since then. I won't move on to that for a moment, but can I ask you to give the chair an example of the sort of work you did when you were a sergeant, working with a team perhaps, of any situations where you came across a knife incident?
Yes. So one knife incident that springs to mind, it started off as a business as usual call. It was a call that there was a disturbance at a particular address. So a neighbour had rang in just saying there's a bit of noise. So if it sounded on the basis of it was just a routine police call. On this particular night in question, it was a public holiday. I was the sergeant. I was down to minimum staff. I had three, if I remember correctly, I had 3 constables on duty. I had 1 constable single crewed in a vehicle, and I had 2 constables in the van. Of those 2 constables, the man was a probationer, so he didn't have his 2 years service in, and then there was a female officer with him, and I think, I'm unsure, but I think she maybe had around 5 years, but I could be wrong. She certainly wasn't a probationer, but she had a bit more service, but not as much as what I did. Because of the address that was given over the air, I recognised this address as being an address. It was a house that was converted into at least 3 bedsits that were used by the local authority to house single occupancy. And so I knew that we'd been to that address on numerous times, and there may be an increased risk because of the people who we knew either lived there or went there.
Was that information that you were aware from your local knowledge of the area?
Yes.
Right.
So based on that fact, I didn't want the 2 officers arriving on their own, because I believed that this had potential of being a higher risk. The only other officer that was available was me, so I was going to go as well. So I notified those 2 officers not to attend the scene on their own and to pull over.
But you've said you had 3 constables.
Yes.
1 was single crewed.
Yes, so
Where was
she
that?
was currently out of our policing area, backing up on a rural alarm activation. So the rural area had sent a single crew to a premises alarm, and because they were single crewed, she was then going from the town to back up that member of staff.
So you were left with 2,
So I was left with
a
2.
probationer and a constable with about 5 years service.
Yes, but I could be wrong on the length of time, but yes. So then I instructed them to pull over on the way to there, because I knew from my own mind the location towards them, where they'd have to go. There was a dual carriageway in one direction that they needed to travel along. There was a dual carriageway with 30-mile-an-hour limits. I asked them to pull over and wait there so we could RV.
Explain what
so
RV
we could rendezvous.
means.
So it was so we could rendezvous and both turn up together, because I didn't want just one vehicle turning up on their own.
And
So
that was something that you could do as the sergeant?
Yes, definitely. Because ultimately my job was to also safeguard and protect the officers' health and safety. So then as I pulled up behind them, we both moved off and we both pulled up at the premise together. We all got out of the vehicles. We walked into the front garden area, which was part walled, so you couldn't instantly see what was happening behind there. And the first thing that I was confronted with was the front door of the premise being open. The lights were all on in the communal hallway, and there was a young man laid on the floor with an arterial bleed from the neck, which was, it seemed to be hitting the ceiling. It was really high. And another young man then who appeared to be crouched over him, standing up to his feet. So at that point, in my mind, then all of these little checklists start appearing, because then I'm thinking preservation of life, which is always the priority. So we've got a casualty there who appears to have an arterial bleed, and this is a life and death situation. We've got our only suspect on the scene, so potentially here we've got a murder stroke attempted murder scenario. We've got potentially a knife or other weapons. We might have other people. We might have so all of these things are going, and I'm thinking about forensic contamination then between the different people and the scenes. I instantly drew my baton, which was on the left-hand side, so I pulled it and racked it, because we were on it. There was no opportunity to conduct anything from further than where we were, and I needed one of my officers to go and start life-saving. I also immediately, so I directed the female constable, to deal with the life-saving, thinking then that with the probationer, I would stay with him, and between us we would effect the arrest of the only suspect that was at scene. I needed her to get by the only suspect, so I gave him the command then to move out of our way.
And you're holding your
Yes.
hand out there.
So I'm instructing him to move aside to let the officer through and put his hands on his head, which was tactics that we used to use in the police support unit, especially with suspected firearms or weapons. You get the person to get the hands to the head. So then I could clearly see then there was no weapon in his hands. So I asked him to move over to the side to allow the officer behind, and I instructed that officer to start dealing with the casualty. I instantly informed control, urgent, ambulance required, arterial bleed, and urgent backup required. But I knew the closest backup was likely to be at least 30 minutes away at another town. So then I'm trying to keep distance, and I'm thinking about the probationer officer, because I had him since he came from training school. So he'd been on my shift, so whether I was in custody or patrol, I had a close working relationship with him. So I instantly knew this was potentially the most significant event he'd been confronted with. So I was speaking to the person, but I was trying to be calm, because I didn't want to, if he was an armed suspect, I didn't want him to go into flee mode, as in thinking then he's got to fight his way out. So I was trying to keep everything down and keep calm, talk to me, what's happening. And he just kept his hands up to his head. I then informed him that I was going to send the male officer to him with handcuffs, to put handcuffs on him, and that I didn't want him to resist the officer. So then he was compliant. He said okay, and I asked him to turn away from us, keep his hands on his head, and the officer was going to approach gently from behind and take his right arm first. So then I indicated to the constable to approach. He got the cup on the right hand, that got brought down, then the next hand came down. We then took him to the van, and at the van we searched him, cursory searched to see if there was any weapon, couldn't find any weapon. I'm then calling over to constable there for any update on the injured party. She was in distress, because it was obvious there that this was an emergency situation for life. I'm updating control then, any update on the ambulance, can they confirm it's attending, and to ensure that they've told them it's a suspected arterial bleed. We haven't yet found the weapon. We got the man into the back of the van. But now I'm conscious as well that for forensics, there's me and this male constable have now dealt with the male suspect. So if we now go to the victim, we could be transferring DNA as well. So I'm trying to keep away from the casualty. But I'm also aware that the suspect, now that he's handcuffed, needs constant supervision.
Why do you say that?
That's because of the risk of any form of restraint. So it's general principle that certainly since 2006 they've used the codes of level 1, 2, 3 and 4 for supervision levels, and level 3 is applicable to anybody who's once they're in restraints because they can't fully protect themselves and because of the risk of any medical emergency as well. So I was conscious he needed constant supervision, so we got him in the van and closed the Perspex door. But then I told that constable he had to stay at the door and keep observations on the suspect. So then at that point I heard a screech of brakes and a thud, and turned around to see on the road a car had ran a pedestrian over. So now I've got a pedestrian laid on the road and this car. And I'm just thinking, is this an inspector's promotion scenario? So then I ran over to this. So again, I'm thinking preservation of life. My priority was, is this another life and death casualty or not? Because I've already got a preservation of life there, plus now an enforceable requirement for the suspect who's being arrested. As I get over to the incident scene, the person who's been hit now stands themselves up and limps to the pavement. So now I'm calling up, we need a second ambulance because we've got an RTC, walking wounded. So I tell that person to sit on the side, and then thinking about the priorities. And at that point, it wasn't the NDM, the National Decision Making Model, it was the predecessor, the conflict management model, which was basically the same thing. But then thinking about threat and risks and priorities, I then inform the car driver they need to take themselves to the police station and report the incident and stay there. That's because of the other priorities that were going on.
So you're continually, in light of new information, feeding that into this process of considering threat and risk and priorities.
Yes.
And you're reacting every time something else happens, you're reacting to that and factoring that into your decision-making process.
Yes, and then as I rushed back over to the scene of the other going on, I was then aware of a group of young men who came from that direction who had what looked like baseball bats or wood with them, and one of them was banging it on a wheelie bin and throwing abuse at us about what they were going to do. And again, I'm thinking, could this get any worse? So at that point, I still had the baton withdrawn from earlier. I then pulled my CS as well.
So
and
again, you're taking account of the equipment that you have available to you.
Yes.
That's another resource,
Yes.
as well as
and thinking about people, object, place, and thinking about people. There's only me who can deal with this, and I want to deal with it quickly and probably differently than I would have done under normal circumstances.
We've heard about some evidence about a mnemonic POP,
Yes.
POP,
Yeah.
people, object, place.
Yes. And people's looking at the people you're dealing with, but plus the person yourself as well, and thinking about your own capabilities. How many of you is there, and what's your competency? So, for example, if I compare myself now as a 52-year-old to when I was first promoted to a sergeant as 27, at 27 I was running marathons in the gym most days, and I was fit and healthy, and now I'm not. So even looking at a situation now, I'd be thinking, I'm not going to get up off the floor as quick now as I would have then. So I've got to take my demographics into consideration. Plus I wanted this to be dealt with so I could deal with priority of life.
So when you're considering people, it's not just the subject it's not just members of the public, it's yourself and your own skills and
Yes,
experience.
and people's competencies, and likewise then thinking about, you know, the initial decision of a probationer constable and a more experienced constable, who am I going to direct to the casualty?
So it's their skills and experience of members of your team.
Yes, and that comes from knowing your team and having a bit of knowledge about who you've got, what experience they've got, what exposure have they had already, and then trying the best that you can.
Yeah.
So thankfully this group then eventually went when they realised the severity of what was going on, and then we could start dealing. Then it was probably about 30 minutes in total before extra police officers had attended. But by that time, the ambulance had attended before any police resources attended.
And during this whole event, you've said that you were on the radio feeding back.
Constantly.
And is that the same
Yes.
to ACR or the control room? And would that be audible to other members of the police
Yes,
service?
and anyone who was on that radio channel, in addition to the control room, and it was trying to prioritise our incident, hopefully, to feed back to the control room, because if they've got staff at other incidents, if they then know what we're dealing with, so they know now that at this scene for 3 officers, we've got a suspect who is a suspect who is detained, a casualty who might die, potentially a murder scene, an injured party from a road traffic collision, and a potential public order, all in one, then hopefully they would prioritise us over other incidents.
One would hope so.
Yeah.
But sharing that information on your radio, we've heard evidence that then allows the control room to take steps, appropriate
Yes.
steps. It allows other officers to be aware of the situation and also take appropriate action.
Yes, definitely.
And that was your experience during that
Yes.
event. Thank you. And you mentioned at the beginning that you RV'd or rendezvoused.
Yes.
We've heard some evidence about the nature of a rendezvous point, and you've told us that you've listened to Martin Graves's evidence.
Yes.
And we heard about, there can be an officer with a marshal, I think he called
Yes.
him. Are you able to help us understand the distinction between that type of rendezvous point and the one you described?
Yes, so we have basically 2 different types of rendezvous point. One's called the RV point, and one's called a forward control point. So at the lowest level is your RV point, and that can just be a case of pulling over on the side for a few seconds while somebody else catches up. It's looking at it's a temporary. It's not permanently blocking the road that you need a local authority permit for to do. It's a very brief pull over, hang on till I catch up. That can be your RV point.
Can that be organised on a spontaneous way?
Absolutely, yes.
Is that like the scenario you described in your example there?
Yes, and certainly with teams I've worked with, I would always encourage them to, if there's more than one patrol going, hang back so that you can both turn up together. And plus, certainly in Cumbria, we weren't always double crewing, so you could end up with a 2 and a 1 or 2 ones turning up. But what I didn't want, as far as possible, was just one vehicle turning up.
Why not?
Mostly, one aspect is the presence, the physical presence, particularly if it's a call about disorder outside of clubs or pubs. If public see 2 vehicles turning up, then those who maybe don't have any intent to continue disorder, just the sight of the vehicles turning up, they are likely to run from the scene. So it's just to try and show that physical presence with 2. Or if you've then got a scenario where you have got an injured party and a suspect, you've got enough people to instantly deal. So I just find from an operational point of view, if you can get people, if that just means delaying something by a very short time, it can be a more efficient and effective police response, and both for safety and policing priorities.
And so it's not just the policing priorities, it can be the safety. Whose safety could be benefited by that approach?
Everybody's safety can be benefited, because if you've got then the officers, the public, the suspects that you're dealing with, by having enough staff attend initially, it can contain people, it can stop people then fleeing amongst the crowds and across other publics. It can help with officer safety, so that they then, if one officer turns up on their own and there's 2 or 3 offenders, especially if they're drunk, they're more likely to feel they can challenge the officer. So that visual presence can often assist and negate any trouble straight off. But the forward control point, that was brought in with the command and control training as well in relation to major incidents, and the command and control point, the forward control point. The forward control point is a more permanent RV point. So it can be, for example, short term, like half an hour or an hour. There is no formal time limit with this, or it can be weeks or days. And usually then you do need marshals, because you decide, it's typically a car park or a large open hard standing, and you'll cordon off different parts. So you'll say all police resources go there, all ambulance resources go there, local authority there, etc. So everyone will have an area. There'll then be established briefing sessions, there'll be toileting, catering, everything then will be brought to that forward control point. And even from a police point of view, the national riots there, when forces were sending the staff down to like London, when every force was sending staff down, even Cumbria we were sending staff down, there would be a forward control point. So you would see roads of just personnel vans parked up. That would be a forward control point. So it doesn't always have to be a car park, it can be roads that they take over. When we think about the ferries, when the stack up, when they stack the lorries, Operation Stack, they'll have one lane of the dual carriageways allocated as basically the forward control point as well for stacking things and for meeting.
So there's both the planned rendezvous point, a more established structure, if I can call it that, and then you've got your more spontaneous,
yes,
which can just be officers agreeing to meet in
yes,
advance and arriving
yes,
on
and then if that RV point became a more long-term thing as part of the planning, then you'd be looking at silver or bronze, looking for a nominated RV point, a more formalised, and then it could become a more formalised RV point or forward control point.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you about something in your CV which says you specialised in safer handling of detained persons and safer custody,
yes,
and the use of force.
Yes.
Could you tell the Chair a little about that experience that you have?
Yes. So if we go back then to the early 1990s, and the culture then within the police was if a person was arrested, they went into the cells, often without being searched. They had belts on, they had property in the pockets. Things like death in custody wasn't really considered or given priorities. Often the detainees weren't visited through the night. A lot of the safety control measures weren't there. As time evolved, and certainly from 1996 as an acting, doing some custody function, but then 1997 being a custody sergeant, the cultures then were changing in relation to safer custody, safer detention. That was then formalised from 2002. The UK became signed up to the agreement to adopt safer custody principles, and that was across all of the secure sectors where a person's held by the state. So that's police, prison, mental health units, immigration, military prisons. So
were these European standards in relation to custody?
Yes.
I think you mentioned this in your report.
So that was from 2002 voluntary, 2006 mandatory. So in 2006, between these times, certainly from the late 90s, there was a lot of change starting to happen, and the Independent Police Complaints Commission for England at the time, they were conducting lots of research in relation to deaths in custody and what people were most vulnerable, how control measures could have or should have helped, examples of when it did help. So there was a lot of research going on for that sort of 10-year period of time. From 2006, there was a document published called the Safer Detention and Handling of Persons in Police Custody. So shorthand, it was called the SDHP 2006.
And was the Scottish police force part of that drive to comply with the European
Well, they were part
standards?
of the UK movement, but the 2006 SDHP was written specifically for England and Wales. But there were similar things happening throughout then, like Ireland and Scotland as well. But certainly my experience at the time was just in England. But it took from 2006, it formally recognised that custody began from the point of initial contact. So then from point of initial contact, that would also take into account all the issues around the NDM, like what was the known information, the threat, the risk. So then that 2006 edition was updated in 2012 as the SDHP 2012, but it certainly then took everything back to that initial point of contact. So my work then, from 2006, because I had been involved in custody by then for 10 years, and I was a qualified Home Office trainer as well, and I'd also done a lot of research at the time and proposed practices that needed to change, certainly within Cumbria. I then became involved in the training, delivery and design for implementation of change. Now I then designed a training course which was then taken by what was the National Police Improvement Agency at the time. They then adapted that and adopted it and then put it out as a national package in order for bringing about change as quickly as possible in relation to practice. And that again was going right back to that initial contact.
And that related to custody?
Custody
and
of a
safer custody.
Safer custody, yeah. So commonly the umbrella term used throughout all of the different agencies was safer custody.
But that package that was delivered and rolled out
Yes.
nationally, that related to from the point of contact
Yes,
between a subject and a police officer.
yes,
So people shouldn't imagine custody is only when you're in the custody cells
Definitely
in
not.
a police office.
yes.
And your training, which you delivered to your training package, was designed to improve the standards
Yes,
and
and the
implement
standards
change,
of the
I think you
control
said.
measures.
Yeah. And what sort of things are you thinking when you say control measures?
Well, recognition of what then becomes a risk factor. So there's certain conditions which have constantly remained identified risk factors throughout all of the custody risks. That's head injuries, alcohol intoxication, drug intoxication, mental ill health, asthma, diabetes, angina. So those are specified risk.
Recognised risks
Yes.
for someone in custody.
Yes, and those are particularly specified as topics, standalone topics, where if any of those are identified, then you must obtain appropriate clinical attention as soon as practicable.
So any of those risks require some sort of medical
Yes.
attention being
Yes.
given to the
Yes,
person.
regardless of whether the police officers or the person acknowledge there's any problem with it.
Right. So any of those risks, if they're recognised or known, require some sort of medical intervention.
Yes, and you'll find now that if any of those risk factors are identified, reasonable custody sergeants will not book those people in. They'll instantly say to the presenting officers, you must go to hospital with that person first. Or a lot of custody units now have embedded healthcare professionals working and based from there. They'll have the healthcare professional come and see the person before they even start booking them in.
Right. Can you think of any examples that you could maybe share with the chair where you've come across a situation where someone was having a mental health crisis who was in custody, in police custody?
Yeah, certainly as a custody sergeant, In my early days of custody sergeant, we didn't have CCTV throughout the custody. So you're up and down the custody block checking your detainees regular, and at that point we didn't have detention officers neither. So I used to find that once the arresting officers went, it was just me and all the detainees, that was it. So I had to do all of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, all the legal requirements, as well as all of the welfare requirements for the detainees. And I'd been up and down the cell block throughout the tour of duty. It was a night shift. And I happened to go back down to do the regular checks, and I noticed from one of the cells there was some water coming from under the door. So I tried to tiptoe towards the door and look through the hatch, and I seen the man who was inside the cell was now naked, stood on the bed, and the floor of the cell was wet. So it appeared that he had blocked the toilet and caused it to overflow to wet. I opened the hatch and I seen that he'd released the lights from the ceiling, and all the electrical wires were hanging down now as well. So those wires were live, water on the floor, he's on the bed. By looking at him, I could instantly see he was in some form of crisis. And so the last thing I wanted to do was create a negative reaction from him. And something that I was taught back in 1994 when I did my Home Office trainers course, we were taught this philosophy of transactional analysis, about how to communicate with different people. And what it was looking at is people will always move between a childlike state, an adult state, or childlike state, an adult state, or a critical parent state. And in child state, you've got free child, the happy child, and this is where your happy drunk, who by day they're a professional person, and then they have a few drinks. The happy drunk, they're jumping up and down, walking down the streets with cones on their heads. No malice, but a lot of people looking at them will go, that's disorderly conduct. But they're having this free child moment of having a laugh, pushing the colleagues on the chairs down the corridors in workplaces. That's the free child. The alternative to that free child is the child who's maybe then having your 2-year-old tantrums, who's very, at that point at the moment in time, might be egocentric upon themselves. They need they're upset, they need some instant satisfaction in relation to something, and they're very much involved in their own moment of crisis, and that crisis could be for a whole host of issues. Then at the other end you've got parent, so you could have nurturing parent or critical parent. So as people, if they've got children, might know that at times they need to go between the two different forms of parent to get a suitable response from the child. So the idea is, in order to get people functioning, we need to be an adult. So if somebody's in a childlike state, a positive way of dealing with them is to go into a parent state in order to try and bring them to the adult state. So for me then, faced with this, if I saw people who appeared to be in crisis, I'd always try and go into nurturing parent mode initially, because it's easier at times to escalate my response up than if you go in at critical parent. It's hard then to turn to nurturing parent because you've lost the trust. So
what does a nurturing parent do? So
this is with a person who might then be going, what's up? What do you need? Can I help you? And same as if your child was crying, you'd be going, what do I need to do to help you? What's going to make you feel happier? So it's that nurturing parent to try and stop the moment of crisis.
And what's the critical parent?
So the critical parent will be things like, stop doing that, get to your room now, and just ignoring the reason for the crisis. It's more a didactic instruction.
Right, sorry, carry on.
Sorry. So I used to try, and if I seen somebody in any form of crisis or on the potential of being crisis, I would always try and be that nurturing parent. And particularly in a cell block environment, you're dealing with a lot of people who have lost their liberty, who have a whole host of different crisis issues for themselves there. And I used to feel it was like working in a powder keg, and the least spark could set everything off. So I used to always find, as a custody sergeant, I would try and be nurturing parent to try and keep things as calm and smooth as possible, but then knowing if I needed to go into critical parent, I could. So seeing this situation, thinking about risk and everything, and the information I was receiving was, I've got a person in here who is now, they're acting unusual, they've taken the clothes off. Usually people only take the clothes off in a cell if the police have taken them off. But I've now got a naked man in the cell. He's on his bed. He's not looking like you would expect the person to look. So I was thinking that's an unusual look. So that could either be a crisis through any mental illness. It could be a crisis through drug or drink withdrawal. It could be anger. There could be a whole issue. But I just knew this wasn't the normal state. I wanted to be careful with this because I also knew there was electrical wires hanging from the ceiling and there was water throughout the cell and a little bit coming out from the door, so I needed to make sure I wasn't in the water. I then instantly went into the nurturing parent and I said his name and I said, how can I help you? And at the same time I touched the silent alarm button on the wall, because there was only me in the cell block and there was other detainees as well. I knew then officers would be coming because the silent alarm activates in other parts of the station and also at the area control room. So I knew then that they would also pass over the air to officers that the alarm had activated in the custody unit. I'm then trying to talk to him, but I don't want him to react spontaneous. I don't want him jumping off the bed and in anger, so I'm just trying to say to them, just stay there, let's talk about things, how can I help you? I'm trying to buy time, trying to keep everything calm. As I'm hearing the officers entering the custody block, I've got my hand up to tell them to stop. So then I actually said to him while he's standing there, can I make you a cup of tea or coffee? And he asked for a cup of tea. So I said, okay, I'm going to be away for just a short time while I put the kettle on, stay on the bed. So then as I pulled the hatch up and walked away, I'm whispering then to the colleagues that we need the electricity cut to that cell to disconnect that live wire. I also need a shield team. I need 2 officers for a 3-person shield team, because as part of my police support unit, I was trained in shield tactics. So usually as the sergeant, you would have your 2 constables in front with the shield, and as the sergeant, you'd be behind them holding their utility belts, directing where you wanted them to go, and also trying to then communicate with the subject. So I wanted that function to be available in case I needed it, but I was hoping we could just resolve this. So the officers then, when I wasn't going to open the door, the officers went off to do what I'd asked them to do. I went back to the cell with the cup of tea, but by that point, I got the notification that they'd got the switch cut to the lights for that cell. So I knew now that the power was cut. So I was able to tell him that I've cut the power to the cable. We've had that cut, so you can come and get your drink. He then got his drink, went back to the bed, sat down. We were talking through the hatch. Then after a little while, I said to him, we could talk further and resolve things, but we needed to get him out of that room now to a dry cell, and we needed him to be dressed. I would get the doctor to come out and see him, etc. He agreed that he would come out quiet. I told him there were other officers there now, but as long as he was calm, we would just move him, and those officers wouldn't get involved, and thankfully he came out, no problem, went into another cell.
You've described what you saw when you arrived in the cell. Am I right in thinking you're assessing the risks as you see what's in the cell?
Constantly, yeah.
And it's risk to yourself from
Yes.
the water and the electricity, and risk to the subject.
Yes.
There were no other members of the public around at that
No.
time. And you talked about buying time and keeping them calm.
Yes.
Can you explain the benefits of buying time via that communication?
I mean, one of the key ones for buying time is for me as the officer and my decision-making process, because you've got multiple, for me, I'll be seeing multiple lists spinning around in mid-air thinking I've got all of these. And I'm trying to think, what am I actually dealing with? Am I dealing with a person in distress? Am I dealing with a medical crisis which needs a medical response? Am I dealing with a police response, as in a crime? Or, I don't want it to escalate, because it might be a medical response which, if I deal with wrong, could turn into a crime. So all the time I'm buying a bit of time, thinking time for me. I'm also buying thinking time for colleagues, buying time to get other colleagues in place so that we can be prepared for what contingencies we might need. So with that one, for example, saying about the shields, in case we needed the shield entry, I wanted staff kitted up with the shields in the cell block unit, just so that they were there and ready. So it's buying yourself time, and it's trying to calm it down a bit more as well, and build up that rapport and trust, so that the person, you'll often find that if you treat the person with that nurturing parent side, they might strongly dislike other officers, but they'll like you. And certainly as the custody sergeant, the amount of time that I could get detainees who were threatening to not leave the cell without fighting, but then if I then went down and said, will you come with me, they were happy to go, because I'd already built a bit of rapport with them.
We may have heard some evidence that's dismissive of the idea of offering someone a cup of tea, and it would appear that you actually literally did offer this person.
I would regularly use it, even going to see victims of crime. If a person has rang and they're distressed, because they might be distressed that somebody's been and damaged the property or whatever, often a line I would start with would be, why don't you make yourself a brew, and then we'll sit down and I'll take some details of you while I'm getting my kit out. You get a brew. And it was just, sometimes I'd go, no, I don't want one. But it was just that throwing it in, and I would be going back to that earlier training of thinking about try being nurturing, because if it's not putting me at risk or anyone else at risk, just that little bit of compassion can then go a long way further on.
So if you or anyone else is at risk, you may take a different view.
Yes. So that first example, for example, where we've got the guy who's got the arterial bleed, we were on that so quick, and I needed to get officers by. That wasn't appropriate then for me to ask about the cup of tea, because it wasn't there. But it was still appropriate, I thought, to start talking to him and ask him to move aside so that the officer could get by. Just given that opportunity. So then if he said, no, I'm not moving, you've got to get past me, then we know where we stand. But it was just all the time was, can I get as much compliance as possible before we have to use force?
And even in that more extreme example where the man has the arterial bleed, you were seeking to communicate with the subject.
Yes, because I just always think that the last thing I want is to start fighting with people, because chances are somebody's going to get injured, and it could be one person or more than one person, and it could be serious injuries. So as much as possible, if we can avoid the use of force and violence, then we could look at minimum use of force, just purely as transportation, handcuffs, if need be.
Thank you. And you talked about in buying time and looking at the person, you could see that this was not normal behaviour. And so is one of the benefits of taking that extra time your opportunity to observe what's happening?
I've always found that, as far as possible, taking that time just to take in as much information. because otherwise you can get just focused on the person and you want to gather as much information from around the scene.
And during that attempts from you to communicate, you said you were speaking through the hatch.
Yes.
We've heard about a principle called the cut principle.
Yes.
Create distance, use cover, and transmit.
Yes.
Would the existence of the hatch be part of the use cover principle?
Yes, so I was keeping the door closed. There was no way I was opening that door because that was my cover. Because otherwise I could be fearful of, do I get dragged in and then it's a hostage scene? I'm now in amongst water and electricity, and so I'd certainly want to keep that hatch there unless there's other members in.
And does that protect your own safety?
Yes, but then opening the hatch allows me to look at the person and for them to see me, because although I could see them through the little eyeglass, it's not good communicating to someone if all they can do is hear a voice. So I wanted them to see my face and to try and reassure them that I was no threat to them. I wanted to help them, and I wanted it to end peacefully rather than not.
And to what extent are you also using your body language, your demeanour, your tone of voice to communicate?
Yeah, I mean, the majority of communication is non-verbal, such as your body language and the tone of voice. So as much as possible, keeping your body as relaxed as you can and open-handed and, you know, like this kind of thing, rather than hands on hips and finger wagging. That would be transmitting a critical parent. So as much as possible, it's relaxed, it's standing back, it's looking, it's saying to the person, talk to me, you know, I want to talk to you, showing my hands through towards the hatch, so not putting them in the hatch, but lifting them up to hatch and saying, you know, talk to me, I'm here to help you.
And you, as we speak now, you're keeping eye contact as well. Is that another important factor?
Yes, because you want to keep your eye on the person as well, to watch for changes, and you're trying to read the person, you're trying to read the face. And if, for example, you're dealing with someone in the street and you're keeping the distance, theory would have it, if you were kept looking towards that door while we're talking, then I need to be thinking you're planning your escape through that door.
Right.
So because often with people, the body language will indicate in the short term what they're going to do.
So that period of observation, again, is about gathering in information for yourself. And then during your description of those events, you seemed to be indicating you were sharing quite a lot of information with the man in the cell about what was happening.
Very much, to keep him informed of what the noises were, for example, because what I don't want to do is pressurise someone into thinking that I'm being devious or for them to think that we're planning an attack. So I'd be saying, officers are coming in now because, you know, they're going to put the waiting down at the bottom of the cell. You know, the cell area, I've got 4 officers down there, so I wouldn't hide that information from them. And just trying to, again, it's just about that trust and rapport. And
you were, in the first example you gave us, in the man with the arterial bleed, you described being on the radio a lot.
Yes.
And sharing information with the control room and other officers. On this occasion, you didn't really mention your use of your radio to that extent. How were you communicating with others?
Well, they could all hear, because the initial communication was through the silent alarm, which there was always a silent alarm within. That's why I'm demonstrating.
Yeah.
If I was at the hatch, there's always a silent alarm button on the wall next to a cell door. So that was my first communication. Although I had a radio on me, the noise within the cell blocks, because it's all metal and stone, everything echoes. And if a person then is in crisis, that is causing a lot more noise and commotion, and it can then stop the communication. If they're hearing all of this noise going on, this white noise, that can take over me being able to talk. So basic issues we're taught when we're dealing with people who are in crisis is to knock your radio right down as far as you can, so it's still live for you to communicate, but you've knocked it right down so that you're not having all of this noise blaring.
So is it fair to say you were tailoring your methods and style of communication to the particular circumstances
Yes.
that faced
Yes.
you at that time.
Yes.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you some questions now about your experience as an expert. I could probably go through that quite quickly if that's fine. Could we look, please, at one of the passages in your report, please? Paragraph 3.2. Sorry, that's page 18. And do I see you've been engaged? Sorry, if you could just come down the page. Yeah, thing. I've been engaged for approximately 150 case reports over the past 5 years concerning deaths or injuries in custody, police custody procedures, and use of force within all of the sector custody, custody sectors. And you also are contactable through email and give advice that way as well. And you say that you provided reports for misconduct cases. Is that against the police?
Yes.
Is that for both the police officers or the police service?
Both. In relation to misconduct, the Police Federation of England and Wales legal teams have engaged me. I've also been engaged by the professional standards departments, and I've been engaged by the IPCC, which is now the IOPC, the Independent Office of Police Conduct.
And you say coroner inquiries?
Coroner, in addition to that other one, the Police Ombudsman Northern Ireland have also engaged me. Yeah, coroner's inquiries, so I've been engaged directly by them.
Fatal accident inquiries in Scotland?
Yes.
Civil and criminal cases?
Yes.
And you've given evidence on a number of occasions?
Yes.
In relation to these reports?
Yes.
And then do we see the split of your cases in this paragraph when you've been called as an expert for the defence? That's roughly 38% of your work?
Yes.
Is this over the past 5 years?
Yes.
And then you've been called by either the prosecuting authority or the claimant 56% of the time. And you've been engaged directly by the coroner 6% of the time. And now you can add that you've been instructed by a public inquiry. Thank you. And you have delivered many training courses for participants since you've left the police force.
Yes.
How many courses or how many participants have you trained?
So since January 2014 until the end of 2021, I've electronically registered 10,800 and something delegates, and that's mostly between conflict management, use of force, like managing behaviour, or first aid. Those are the predominant courses. Then on top of that, there's been the odd child protection course. But the majority of those are either the first aid or to deal with the challenging behaviour.
And am I right in thinking that your cases that you've been involved with as a skilled witness or as an expert have been all over the UK, England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and the Isle of Man?
Yes.
And they've been criminal and civil?
Criminal and civil, yeah.
Yes. And you've acted for members of, you've been instructed, I should have said, by family members or by professional standards or in relation to those matters too. And you're aware of your obligations as a skilled witness, as an expert, that you're actually here to assist the chair and the assessors here today.
Yes.
And you have to be objective and unbiased.
Yes.
Okay. And we'd briefly touched on the fact that in England there's a section of rules called Part 35 which sets out the obligations. You're aware of that as well? Thank you. I'm going to move on to the instruction by the inquiry now, and I wonder if it would be...
It's a convenient point to take a break. Well, we'll take a 20-minute break at this point. Yes, Miss Graham.
Thank you. I'd like now to turn to the letters of instruction you were sent
Yes.
from the inquiry team. And can we look at SBPI 00166 and 00164? We'll start with 166, please. And you'll see this is a letter of instruction dated Tuesday, the 12th of July this year, addressed to you, and I'm not going to take you through the detail of
Yes.
this. It's available for the chair should he wish to consider it. But I'd like to look at a section where we discuss a hypothetical reasonable officer. Sorry, I've not noted which page it's on. I'm sorry, if we can scan down the page. There we are, thank you. Sorry, page 6, thank you. And you'll see that this indicates that we were inviting you to consider a concept as a hypothetical
Yes.
reasonable officer, and to consider that such an officer, his acts or her acts and omissions, would fall to be assessed by the chair, and is that of an officer acting in accordance with the law, their training, standard operating procedures, ethical obligations, and any other guidance available to them. So this is a hypothetical person
Yes.
who complies with the rules and regulations that are on police officers
Yes.
in their actions. And we then go on to mention a number of legal principles. I'll come back to those later. And are you comfortable in proceeding on the basis that when I ask you questions, Miss Caffrey, if you would consider them from the perspective of a reasonable officer?
Yes.
Thank you. And we know that we've heard evidence that a reasonable officer will only use force that is reasonable, proportionate, and the minimum force necessary. Do you understand
Yes.
that? And that there is a principle of preclusion on police officers which dictates that less forceful options must have been attempted and failed, or have been considered and found to be inappropriate in the circumstances. And you
Yes.
understand that
Yes.
principle. Thank you. We've also heard that in any given set of circumstances, that there can be a range of reasonable options open to any one officer.
Yes.
There's not necessarily always one right thing to do, and the officers have a certain element of discretion.
Yes.
And that would be based on what they can see, what they can hear, the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Yes.
And that two officers confronted with the same set of circumstances may react differently. They may select different force options, each of which they perceive to be appropriate and reasonable.
Yes.
And you accept that
Yes.
that's the case. And also that it's for each officer to justify their own individual course of action.
Yes.
You accept
Yes.
that. And also that it will be a matter for the chair to decide what the circumstances were.
Yes.
And whether any justification offered was a reasonable justification. Thank you. I'd like to just briefly look at the second letter of instruction, just for completeness, which is SBPI 00164. And this was a subsequent letter of instruction from the 22nd of September 2022. And this expanded the questions we invited you to consider
Yes.
to include the initial management of the
Yes.
events from the moment the emergency calls were coming in.
Yes.
Thank you. And you've certainly you've looked at all of these issues as part of the body of your report.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, I'd like to begin by focusing on the events from the calls coming in up to the point the officers are about to arrive but haven't yet arrived at Hayfield Road and
Yes.
arrived at the scene. And so I'd like to ask you about a scenario which I'll give you, and then we can ask some questions about how a reasonable officer would act in that situation. So the scenario is that within around 8 minutes, 6 emergency calls have been received. One member of the public is called twice. That information has been taken during the course of those calls by a number of call takers in the control room and noted down on the system, the computer system available. Yes. And that information includes that an African-looking male was chasing a complainer's car, the complainer being the member of the public who's phoning. He thinks he may be carrying a knife. He's big with muscles, about 6 foot, wearing a white t-shirt and dark-coloured jeans. And the male is jumping in front of other cars and stopping them. And that the male, and within a minute of that description, a male in possession of a large knife, black male wearing a white t-shirt, no jacket, walking along the street with a large knife in his right hand, about a 9-inch blade, and walking in the direction of the hospital, walking quickly. And a male, large, 6 feet tall, large knife, wearing white t-shirt, walking in direction of hospital, male in the middle of the road, and that was a grade 1 call, which we've heard is an immediate threat to life, and it's a high risk.
Yes.
You recognise that category. And that information is then put onto the storm log, and in doing so that then comes to the attention of a controller in a control room.
Yes.
And because of the grade 1 nature of that call, it flashes red, and that is immediately on the same screen as the controller, but also on their sergeant, their superior's, supervisor's screen, and also appears flashing red at the same time on the duty inspector's screen in the ACR. So that is the scenario. Thinking about the control room staff, and primarily, first of all, the controller, thinking about a reasonable officer in that position, how long would you envisage that controller would take to respond or react to that grade 1 call on the computer screen?
It would depend on the initial, because every person who's involved needs to conduct some initial risk assessment process, and the National Decision Making Model is the core model that's used throughout the UK, because different people could perhaps interpret risk and threat slightly different as well, and about policies and options. So certainly such a thing coming in, keywords for me are things like 9-inch knife, multiple reports, so it's sort of making it more realistic that there's multiple individuals, so each one's corroborating the other report that's coming in. Male with big muscles, so they could be thinking about, well, this is potentially a strong male, 9-inch knife, risk of death to officers attending, in addition to risks of death to public, and also risk of death to the person themselves. So it's definitely, on that first hearing, this is it's above business as usual. It's not your normal routine sounding call. Usually routine sounding calls where knives or weapons are involved might be one call made saying there's some people fighting, squaring up to one another. I think someone might have a knife, and it's a one-off call. And then you have the other extreme where you say, I'm watching someone now shooting members of the public with a gun, and there's everything in between that. So certainly it's in this unusual stroke suspected, but it's definitely a high risk to either officers attending, because if you're thinking about 9 inches, you don't really want to be having to confront someone with a 9-inch blade because even with your protective equipment, you could still get stabbed and killed.
So we've heard some evidence that officers viewed that as a high-risk incident.
Yes,
It sounds
I
like
would-
you would agree.
I would, yes.
And we've also heard that the nature of there being multiple calls. Some evidence we've heard is that some calls can be malicious or not true,
Yes.
but with there being multiple calls from different sources, different members of the public, that gave an aura of authenticity.
Yes,
or
that would enhance the
truthfulness.
reality of it and truthfulness, yes.
And to what extent, if I tell you that these calls are coming in from 7:10 on a Sunday morning, what comment would you have to make about that?
Sunday mornings, really, the mindset when you go to work on a Sunday morning is that it's usually quiet. You're picking up work from the night shift in relation to, it's more the investigative strategy and dealing with prisoners who have been in overnight. You don't usually get public order or violence to that level on a morning shift.
So to what extent would the timing of the calls cause you any...
That would indicate it's highly unusual.
And we've also heard some evidence that this not being a call about two men fighting in a location, that there's no one that's being fought with, or no
Yes.
no one that's bearing the brunt of any aggression. Again, what difference does that make?
Because of its unusualness, you're identifying then we've potentially got a mobile armed suspect for a criminal side, or we've got a mobile armed suspect for medical help, but we've got a person on the move, and so it's not in a confined place. So that in itself is a logistical problem about how do you find the person, identify them and contain them in an open place where they're on the move.
With logistical problems such as that, what would a reasonable officer be considering at that stage?
More staff, but the best police resource for dealing with a mobile threat is the police dog.
Why do you say that?
Having seen them perform on numerous occasions and at times co-train with them, because as a public order sergeant, you would often combine your public order training with the police dogs as well, because then it helps develop the dogs dealing with the disorder and the chaos that's going along. But you can see that the dog can easily do the work of numerous officers, and it's much safer because a lot of the members of the public, as soon as a dog arrives on the scene, straight off you'll get a proportion of the public who'll say, I don't want to be here if the dog's getting let out. And suspects at times, as soon as they see the dog, they'll just go to the knees and they'll put the hands up because they don't want to deal with the dog. And then it stops all of that physical contact being at risk with the officers.
We have heard some evidence, as you know, from PC Wood, the dog handler, that just the very presence of the dog can
Yes.
provoke reactions.
Yes,
in
very
people.
much so.
You've seen that
Yeah.
yourself.
Yes, and they're excellent. If you've then got a mobile suspect who runs, the police officers aren't always very good at running after the people because that person's hyped up. They're going a lot faster. The officers have got all the different kit on. It's heavy to be running with. The dog can just run after someone really quick. They can contain them. They can stop them from going towards members of the public. And that's another risk at times, that if you can't contain the person efficiently, you're dispersing the risk. And if you're dispersing a person who's already in an agitated state, that can increase the risk to the public. It could push them to take, for example, a hostage or to do something to a member of the public in order to try and effect their escape.
And when you use the word contain, what is it you mean by that word?
To control their ability to leave, so you can contain them in an environment by having like a circle of officers around them, so that you can try and manage and contain them and keep the public away as well. So it's not just one way, you're looking at it both ways. You don't want members of the public becoming involved and you don't want the person having freedom of movement. So it's not a restrain, it's a contain.
To what extent would a reasonable officer in the position of a controller receiving this information, as I've described to you, to what extent would they consider the need for specialist resources? And by that I mean ARV or dogs.
I think it should be a primary thought of the reasonable controller.
Why do you say that?
Because potentially we've got an incident which on the description a control room inspector may decide to deem it a firearms incident. So we've got that period of thinking it's not a normal event, so it could be a suspected firearms incident. But without it even being a firearms incident, it's still a high risk because of the factors of the person, the object and the place that are being mentioned. So certainly I would expect a controller to be seeking supervision advice at the very least in relation to putting it up the scale.
Now, you've said at the very least seeking supervision advice.
Yes.
What does that mean in real terms? What would a reasonable controller be doing?
So your controllers typically are either constables or civilian equivalent, and then control rooms will also have supervisors within the teams as well, which will either be sergeants or civilian equivalents. And they're your midway point between the controller and the inspector. So at the very least, you've got a supervisor of a sergeant or civilian equivalent to turn to for advice.
If in this situation we've heard that there's a red flash on
Yes.
this screen when a grade 1 call or grade 1 calls come in, would a reasonable controller in that situation be comfortable in assuming that the sergeant and the inspector also have that on their screen?
No, you must never assume anything within the police. There's the old phrase about assuming, making an ass of you and me. It's all based on facts and evidence and using that NDM to justify. And so you can never assume that somebody is aware of a fact, because they might not be.
How could a controller draw attention to the matter, draw their attention to the sergeant's attention or
Yeah.
the
Well, what I've
inspector?
seen happen for real in the Cumbria control room, similar setup. You've got an area control room, an inspector's overview desk, you've got supervisors within, and then you've got your call handlers within circles. The call handler then, if they get anything which is not business as usual, they'll instantly be waving the hand for the supervisor to go over, and the supervisor's on the shoulder within seconds looking at what they've got. Usually then, because it's not a business as usual, that controller is allocated as a SPOC, which is a single point of contact.
SPOC,
SPOC,
SPOC.
Yeah, SPOC, single point of contact, because you don't want multiple people involved in the one incident whilst it's getting first assessed, but neither do you want that one person being distracted by other incidents. So once the supervisor then nominates that this person is dealing with this incident, so anything else coming in about this incident come through the SPOC. And likewise in our control room, the inspector's overview was actually in the same room. It was further across, but they could also see the waving of the arms. But you would tend to see the person would either wave, stand up and wave, and the more worried they were, the more they'd be jumping up and down and waving.
Right. What other means would there be to communicate with the supervisors in a control room? Obviously, you've described.
Yeah, so you've got visual, you've got voice, vocal that you can shout to them. Control room staff, if they're going, as in the supervision, if they're going out of the room, they'll typically carry an airway terminal with them. So there's mechanical means of communication as well as the verbal.
Is that, when you talk about an airwaves terminal, is that like a police radio?
Yes.
Yeah. And we may have heard some evidence that in the ACR in Bilston Glen there was a tannoy system?
Yes.
Is that the other alternative?
And that's another option, yes.
Right. would it be within the range of reasonable options in this scenario for a controller to send one unit?
I wouldn't think that was reasonable for a risk that's above business as usual.
So what would you think would be a reasonable response for a reasonable controller in that situation?
Well, definitely because of the knife implication and multiple call-ins, you need that controller before they even dispatch anyone, having supervision input. So I'm aware the Scotland SOP in relation to if it's a suspected firearms, you must immediately refer it to the...
I'll come on to that in a moment.
But certainly you want that person giving out the keep safe message, and if they're deploying people, it's in relation to do not intervene, and it's about visuals only to feed back more intelligence in relation to do we have what we're getting informed of. But you don't really want just two officers turning up. Now, at times, if every other officer was engaged on a higher priority incident, then you're maybe just left with what you're left with, and those are the risks of policing. But that's where you go through the national decision-making model to think this is the level of risk. The control measures around this are to send sufficient numbers of staff who are competent of dealing with it, with the sufficient control measures around numbers, backup, capabilities, instructions.
Right. Can I go over some of this in a little bit more detail? You've said you might just be left with two officers. Is that similar to the example you gave us earlier this morning where you had a probationer and a female officer at 5 years?
Yes.
That was the extent of your team?
And we didn't know it was a knife incident. But if it was a knife incident, then I still wouldn't be happy with us just turning up like that without tactical decisions being made before we got there. Where was the dog handler? How far away were they? Where was the armed response vehicle? I still wouldn't be happy just three of us turning up at an arterial stabbing, because then you know if a person's done that, they've got the means and intent to carry on. So again, it's looking at that, balancing up the risk that if they've already stabbed and potentially killed one person, the term cannon fodder, we just then going in as cannon fodder, and at the end of the day, although police officers always go to work knowing that at some point they may have to put their own life on the line, you don't expect to actually be pushed into that role unnecessarily when control measures do exist that can negate that.
Right. So a reasonable controller listening to or being aware from the screen of these calls, having the capacity to listen to messages on the radio, a reasonable controller would not simply send two individuals.
No, I don't believe so.
Yeah. And would it make any difference to know if one of them was a probationer or an officer with a short period of experience in a response team?
That would just increase the risk more, because then you'd be thinking what level of experience have they got. But even if you knew the two officers going both had a background history of police support units where they've trained for shields and that, you would still think it's still not, it can be safer. And you still need to look at safety being a critical factor for the deployment. It's still not safe to send two officers. Then if the background is the probationers and they've got little experience, that just then increases that risk even more.
You've talked about control measures to be put in place. Is this to protect safety of the officers? It's
to protect safety of the officers as well as safety of the suspect that they might be dealing with as well, because if you're too quick to get involved, then you might not then be taking into consideration all of the implications that affect the safe custody. And it might end up not being a police custody issue, it might be a medical issue.
And would it also include safety to potential members of the public?
Absolutely, yes, because as I mentioned before, the last thing you want to do is go in with good intentions but push the person into then running and taking a member of the public hostage or transferring that risk to the public.
And you talked about control measures including, I think I got this down, sufficient numbers of police officers or staff, as
Yes.
you put it. Backup capabilities and instructions. Can
Yes.
you give us a little more
Well,
information?
the primary focus for dealing with any kind of bladed weapon is contain rather than restrain. So to put a containment on, you need more than 2 people. You can't contain someone in an open space with 2. So that's the first thing there. If we're going to attempt containment, we need more than 2. So if 4 or 6 turned up together, you've got a really good chance of a containment. What was the next bit? Sorry.
So you'd said sufficient staff numbers, backup capabilities
Yeah.
and instructions
Yeah.
were control measures.
So you need to know what backup you've got of specialist resources, because if the dog was near to or it was only a matter of short time behind, you might decide then hold everyone back and let the dog go first. But if you know the nearest dog is an hour away, then that's going to impact on can this wait or not. So it's looking at your specialist resources, which would include dog ARV, your PSUs, if there's a PSU on in the policing area as well. That will all impact then on, do these people need to go in or not? Is there a member of public actually at risk? Because we often talk about the hypothetical member of the public, which is to be taken into consideration, but shouldn't then be the justification. Because if your members of staff then get killed, then, but the risk to a member of the public wasn't there, it was hypothetical, balancing the risk then where you've got dead officers when there was actually no member of the public anywhere near. So all the time you've got to be balancing this up.
So again, it's the actual circumstances on the ground.
Yes,
Which,
and each time it's going to be different. Yeah.
and then you talked about a keep safe message
Yes.
being given. Can you explain to us what you would expect a reasonable controller to be doing?
So keep safe messages, they should always be part of your annual refresher training for the use of force as well. But it's all about being clear with any message as well. And when you're thinking about when officers are responding and travelling somewhere and they're in the vehicles, there's a lot of noise. There's the white noise of everything going on. There's the metal cages rattling. There's traffic. The officers' radios are going. So there's a lot of noise and white noise that are to be dealt with. And messages that are coming over need to be clear and short, because there's theories about how many words we can actually hear when we're in a heightened state. And you're looking at 3 or 4 words per go in order to get words over. So things like do not approach, gap, observations only, So it's those keep safe, because you don't want the officers actually getting close and you're trying to remind them of the health and safety implications of their response, but re-emphasising the tactic option is you're deploying for observation and feedback, so a tactical plan can be decided.
To give the officers time to consider the plan.
Yes.
And you said, would feedback be part of that stay safe message?
Yes, definitely. It's observe feedback.
And we've heard that officers are trained to do this, but a stay safe message is effectively a reminder. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
If a controller is receiving information in the scenario I've given you, and is in the situation where it's a grade 1 call, immediate threat to life. You've described how your view is that a reasonable controller would be seeking to make contact or draw it to the attention of a supervisor.
Yes.
If that supervisor is, I'd like to ask you about if that supervisor is absent from their station, if I can call it that, their position. Are there circumstances where it is reasonable for a sergeant in a control room to be absent from their position?
If we're going to the bathroom, for example, they're going to leave, but that's why you have multiple supervisors and you have deputies, so that there should always be, as a function, there should always be controller, supervisor, incident managers in the ACR inspector. Those three functions should be available 24/7 as a basic command and control police response.
And where one or other is absent from their position, what would the reasonable member of staff in the ACR, what arrangements would they make to have their position covered during that period of absence?
So usually you'd find where there's teams like that, one person going would say, I'm just going to the loo, can you watch my team? Well, I'll be back in 5 minutes. Or, so there'll always be that notification to one another to say, I'm just popping out, I'm just popping to here. So that people knew you were away from your desk. And then when you come back, you go, I'm back, to make sure that they know that you're back.
So you'd let people know when you were away,
Yes.
so that cover can be put in place immediately?
Yes.
And when you return, so they
Yes.
can stop doing that task?
Yes.
And are there circumstances, well, let me look for a moment at the Armed Policing Operations SOP 2014, which is PS 10985. Now, you'll see on the screen it says Armed Policing Operations Standard Operating Procedure. And we've heard some people call this a firearms SOP.
Yes.
And is it commonly known in
Yes.
that?
So you'll commonly shorten it to firearms SOP, dog SOP, custody SOP.
Right. And can we look please at section 1.2 on page 5? And you'll see there on the screen, purpose 1.2, whilst a policy of contain and negotiate may be a preferred response to many firearms incidents, it should be clearly understood that there is no single policy or tactic contained within the APP or National Police Firearms Training Curriculum available via the Chief Firearms Instructor that can provide an all-encompassing response to meet all types of threat that may be anticipated or encountered.
Yes.
Are you able to explain what that means?
So what that's saying there is that would be the preferred option.
Contain and negotiate?
Yes. Unless you can show why it wasn't.
Right.
So it's like with a lot of the guidance, it's the preferred option unless you can justify why it wasn't. So it may be, I wouldn't even say if they had a hold of someone, because the last thing you want to do is try and grab hold of someone who's already got like a hostage, because even that one you would be wanting to contain and back off and bring in professional negotiators in order to deal with that person. But yeah, that's the preferred, unless something. So just thinking there, if the person then dropped their weapon and they were seen to drop the weapon and then the fumbling, you might then think, I'm taking my opportunity and go for them. But if the person's holding a weapon, or you believe they've got access to a weapon but you can't actually see it, then the preference would still be contain and negotiate where possible.
And that's an option that's available to individual officers
Yes.
in the course of their duties?
Yes.
And can we look to page 10 now, please, paragraph 8.4. And you'll see that it says spontaneous firearms incidents. 8.4.1, a spontaneous firearms incident can be described as an incident that takes place without warning, the circumstances of which demand that armed support to the initial police response must be considered, So considered, and then it should be borne in mind that this may include situations where the subject is not in possession of a firearm or other potentially lethal weapon, but is otherwise so dangerous that the deployment of police firearms resources may be required to safely control the situation. For example, in some situations where persons are in possession of unedged weapons, hostage situations, etc. Now, it may be that we've heard some confusion, or there may be some potential confusion, that this SOP is all about guns and firearms. Can you explain what a spontaneous firearms incident can include?
Yes, so it can include reports of a knife of any description. Typically, the larger the knife, the more likely it is to activate the SOP, but it could be a penknife if the behaviour of the person with it is such. Because you've got your sharp objects from a penknife up to a machete or a big scythe or something, and everything in between there. But it's that call coming in saying that somebody is now going down the street and stabbing people, or somebody's on a train going down the train stabbing people in the seats. You know, that's not a gun, but it's still it would still be classed as a firearms incident. And I know previous witnesses mentioned about bow and arrows. All of that would fit in as well. Any lethal weapon, so any sharp weapon, any lethal weapon that could kill a person.
And that would include a large knife, or
Yes.
a 9-inch blade?
Yes.
Would they have to be stabbing somebody
No.
for this
No.
to come under this definition?
No. If you just think that because of the circumstances of the item and or the circumstances of the incident as well as the item, it's considered to be too dangerous to send officers in.
Unarmed officers?
Yes. So the person with the big machete, you know, it's going to be nearly as long as a police baton, and it's not really ideal to send a police officer in with a baton against a machete. So straight off you would say that's a firearms incident. A person then with a 9-inch blade, it could be a kitchen knife, it could be a machete. You don't know until you get to see, but 9 inches can still kill a person with one stab.
And it says there on the second bullet point, it can be a firearm or a potentially lethal weapon. But a knife is a potentially
Yes.
lethal weapon.
Yes.
And it says otherwise so dangerous that the deployment of police firearms resources may be required to safely control the situation.
Yes.
So, in fact, is it possible that someone, even without a weapon, could fall within this SOP?
Yes. Yes, they could if it was considered that they were too dangerous to deal with. And that's because of the fact the firearms officers also have the taser.
And that would be based on what? What would that assessment of otherwise so dangerous amount to?
So it's all the information coming in. There may be throwing items of risk at people where you can't actually get near them. And so the tactical option could be to instruct firearms, the ARV response, because it's otherwise too dangerous to send officers into them.
Thank you. Could we look at page 12, please? I'd like to look at section 9 now, beginning with 9.4. And this may be going back to what you said earlier. On receipt of a suspected firearms incident, the controller will immediately alert the initial tactical firearms commander, ITFC, of the incident. And so can I be clear about this section? Is it a necessity that a firearms incident be declared before any of this SOP is
No.
implemented?
The requirement is that if it's a suspected, that it's brought to the attention of the ITFC before officers are deployed. So it doesn't have to be declared a firearms. It can still remain, it's suspected, but we need more information. And therefore, we're going to still deploy officers who aren't armed, but with stringent control measures and tactical plan directions.
Right. So either declared a firearms incident, in which case it's absolutely part of this SOP,
Yes.
or it could be suspected. You need more information, but you then couple that with stringent control measures.
Yes.
Thank you. And the sort of control measures, stringent control measures, are those the ones you mentioned earlier when
Yes,
we were discussing?
and it could even be deploying staff in an unmarked police vehicle first, so that you're not attracting the attention of people to it being a marked police vehicle. So your officers might still be in uniform, but inside an unmarked vehicle at a distance, in order to get closer or even drive by and feed back the information then.
We'll come back to that. And where it says initial tactical firearms commander, if the scenario was that the ITFC was also the duty inspector, would that be the duty inspector?
Yes.
Thank you.
Which those two roles nationally go hand in hand. You usually find that the control room inspector is also an ITFC.
We've heard that that involves extra training
Yes.
for the officer. And then 9.5, the ITFC will ensure that it is clearly highlighted that they are in command of the incident. So can you explain what that would look like on the ground?
Yeah, so in command and control, certainly from either the training I received and the training I delivered, and also from incidents where inquiries have been held and recommendations, there's always this there's often this incident about who was in control of what aspects. And so certainly the training emphasises that it must always be clear who is in command of what function and doing what. So you'll often hear officers actually then on the airway saying, I am whoever, I am in command of this incident, or I am in command of the bronze scene, I am the silver commander. And so you'll hear people actually declare during incidents saying, I am and the name, and saying what they're in command of.
And what's the benefit of declaring that on the radio?
So that all staff involved then know who they're listening to and who they're feeding back to and who they're asking for advice from, because you've got the three aspects. You've got the bronze at the scene, and you've got the tactical plan decisions and resourcing decisions. So you could have the two different commanders, but as the operational staff, you need to know who's directing what aspect and who takes primacy.
What do you mean by primacy?
It's who out-trumps the other. So if the bronze level said they were going to do something, the silver commander can say, no, you're not. The direction is, this is what you're doing. And likewise, if gold aren't happy with any of them, they come in but you won't get gold going straight to bronze. They come up and down the chain. So gold would then feed to silver, tell bronze not to do this or do that. And so you'll find that the philosophy of command and control is so that every person involved in an incident clearly knows who has what responsibilities and what roles.
Can I ask you for some further guidance? First of all, we'll look at if a firearms incident is declared, and then I'll look at a suspected firearms incident afterwards. So let's take the scenario that a firearms incident is declared. Can you explain who would be in each role? Because we've heard about a controller, a sergeant and an inspector at the ACR.
Yes.
We've heard about a PIO in the area and who's an inspector, and we've heard about a sergeant who's on the ground.
Yes.
I'm trying to understand, if there was a declared firearms incident, who would be in what role?
Okay. So the initial tactical firearms commander is the silver commander. So you would have the ACR inspector as the firearms commander, and they take primacy in relation to the command decisions for the tactical plan and also for resources. So if they then need resources from elsewhere, you can't then have someone else say, no, you can't have them, I've got them doing something else. It's like, no, they take primacy on behalf of the constabulary. So they take the primacy there. At the bronze level, where you have an inspector and a sergeant, because it's a hierarchy force with the police, the inspector will always take primacy over the sergeant. And especially when it's then a nominated PIO role, they would become the bronze commander. the sergeant's role would be delivering the tactics and supervising the staff and you know, doing the delivery with the staff and safeguarding the mechanics and the actual issues for the staff safety and who they're dealing with their safety. But the command decision at Bronze would lay with the PIO.
Right. So if there's a firearms incident declared, the silver command is the ACR inspector.
Yes.
And we've heard some evidence that if a firearms incident had been declared, the ACR inspector would have seized command of that situation. The bronze command would be the inspector, the PIO in the local area.
Yes.
But the local sergeant would be supervising his response team, delivering tactics and doing the mechanics.
Yes, and they wouldn't be a commander.
No.
And you might then get several sergeants there at a bronze. So, for example, I might turn up with a PSU team in order to do a physical entry and search of the property. So then, as the sergeant, I would go to the bronze commander, like the inspector, and ask for the briefing and look at what were we doing. Then I would take my team in to do shield entries and enforced entries and search through the house.
So there could be potentially multiple
There could be
sergeants
multiple
doing
sergeants,
different roles.
yes.
But they would be looking to the local inspector, who would be the bronze commander.
Yes.
And then let's look at the scenario where it's simply a suspected firearms incident. So it's not been declared one by the ACR inspector. Can you help us understand how the governance structure would be in that?
So the principle's still the same. It's rank and role. So you've still got the control room inspector being the initial spontaneous silver commander of any incident until that role is formally agreed and handed over to somebody else. And you've still got, because there's an inspector and a sergeant there, the inspector would out-trump the sergeant in the rank stakes, and the inspector would be responsible for command decisions there.
Yeah. With the sergeant delivering the mechanics on the ground
Yes.
and supervising staff.
Yeah, because one of the core issues around command and control is the ability to manage staff. But if as the sergeant you're actually dealing with the incident, you're not in a position to then manage, look at spreadsheets and go, who can we get from where? You haven't got the authority or the time to do that. So you need people then who aren't actually delivering at the front end, who are in a position that they can look at screens, they've got radio control, they can talk to people and get the resources that are needed.
How do officers on the ground understand that command organisation?
Well, I know the basics of command and control are taught within probationer training in England and Wales. I've not seen the training materials for Police Scotland, but I know that it is covered, the basic principles and management of events and command and control is included in probationer training within England and Wales.
Right. And how would command decisions be shared with officers on the ground?
Through the bronze command. So for example, the bronze commander, so the inspector, unless they get replaced by, if there was a superintendent or a chief inspector on duty there, they might then come down and then announce, I am the bronze commander now, because it works up the rank, not down the rank. So then they would give input to the sergeant, who then delivers the message to the constables. And it's about you don't want lots of different people going for the answers. It's got to be narrow so that you get a message cascading down, up and down the command structure.
And is that, those commands, would they be via the police radio?
It may be via the radio, or if they're physically there, they'll pass it. You know, I know from my own experience, sometimes the location inspector, so the bronze commander, is on the phone to the control room receiving information. They then come to me, brief me, then I go to the PCs and say, right, this is what we're doing.
And when you say me, you're envisaging yourself in a sergeant role
As
on
the
the ground
sergeant's role
with
for
your
that
team
one, yes,
present
yes,
with you.
Yes.
And if, for example, the inspector, the divisional inspector, the PIO, is in a police office, he's on the phone, he can see his screen, but he's not actually communicating on the airwaves at that moment in time. How is it that any command decisions would be shared with the sergeant and the officers?
So they would either then use the radio to notify the sergeant, or mobile phone to the sergeant, or there's the back-to-back channel on the airwave terminals as well.
Is that the same as point to point?
Yes, yes.
So we've heard that there can be direct calls point to point,
Yes.
or there can be airwaves transmissions that effectively
Yes.
anyone can listen to on
Yes.
the channel.
Yeah, but certainly in training we would encourage people not to use the back-to-back and point-to-point because of for records of events afterwards, for the debriefing, for if anything's gone wrong, for critical incident reviewing, managing any civil or criminal cases that come from it. So if they go back-to-back, point-to-point, you're not then getting the audio recorded and translated. So,
I mean, you've probably seen a spreadsheet, a combined audio and visual
Yes.
timeline, which lists
yeah,
airwaves transmissions in chronological order.
yes.
If it's point to point, those calls
They're not
would
going
not
to
be
appear.
part of that. Right, thank you. We then, if we can look at 9.6, each and every incident will require to be progressed on its own merits, and as such will much will depend upon the quality and quantity of the information that is available. Any deployment of police resources to alleged high threat situations should follow safe response procedures unless there are sound and objective reasons to discount the allegations. The facts that a reporter appeared to be under the influence of drugs or alcohol or chose to remain anonymous are not objective reasons to disregard established safe procedures. Can you explain a little about that?
Yeah. So safe procedures it's something you can't always get the safest procedure, so you've got to try and make it as safe as you can in the circumstance. So your initial decision might be the contain and keeping distance, reporting back, but then you see, you know, you're near to a school, it's 3:15 or whatever, it's kicking out time, and now you see a group of primary school children walking towards the person. So you know now you've got this threat, and if you can't get to the children to divert them, you might then have to do something else and stop that distance. But all the time you're reviewing it and thinking, what is the actual risk? Because we've got potential risks of hypothetical risks, but we've also got to weigh that up with what is the actual risk that we're dealing with now. And second to second, minute to minute, that can change. It can go up and down. You know, how are your staff dealing? But it's about, if you are diverting from safer options, which you've been instructed to do, you need to be able to justify it, because ultimately somebody's life's on the line, and that might either be an officer, the subject, or a member of the public. So you need to be able to justify why you've diverted from core tactics.
You're talking about factoring in new information all the time. We've heard some evidence about the NDM, the National Decision Making
Yes.
Model, and how new information is coming in that's immediately factored into
Yes.
this cycle of
Yes.
review.
Yes.
Is that the sort of process that you're describing?
Definitely, and this is always going round. So every little bit of new information, it's coming, and then you might get some information, but then it's discounted, and so you've got to constantly be feeding that in and thinking, what now? What we're going to do now? Do we back off? Do we move forward? You know, left, right? And just because you start with an avenue of actions doesn't mean to say you've got to see it through to the end. You can come back, refresh again, and then move forward again, or stay static.
And
Yeah.
that's always an option for the discretion
Yes,
of
it's
the
always fluid, and it
individual
should always
officers.
be in response to actual threat, risk information, rather than rigid and hypothetical.
you're talking about the speed of change and the speed at which change can happen. Do you understand that, have you got an understanding of how quickly things can change?
Oh, absolutely. Everything changes. The main firearms incident that we had in Cumbria was the Derek Bird mass shootings. And when that happened that morning, again, there's me and my chief inspector in our office outside the control room, and we instantly got contacted by the chief inspector and the control room inspector, just saying they've had a call come in about a shotgun or a weapon's being heard, but I think the initial thing was there's a shotgun sound being heard near the taxi rank in the town. Now, with being a rural force, you're used to firearms incidents, as in we've heard a shotgun, it's like lamping or scaring of birds. But this was unusual because you don't normally in the middle of the morning get a report of a shotgun sound in the town centre at a taxi rank. So straight off, the advice that the control room looked for from us was, do we declare this or not? And we could only, in our roles, we could only provide advice. We can't make the decision. The decision ultimately rests with the ACR inspector. But the advice we gave that day was to immediately declare it a suspected firearms incident, whilst we set up and look for more information, because it's easier to stand everything down than not. So before the ARVs were then being looked for to also inform to start travelling to the areas, but then in the same time second, third calls started coming in, and so I was then in the control room as well, hearing these things coming in, and the dilemma was, is this multiple people reporting the same call, or are these multiple people reporting multiple incidents? And at that point we still didn't know, but we were working on the basis that this was a firearms incident. Now, after that second call was coming in, we're deeming this a firearms incident. My boss went straight upstairs to the chief constable's suite to get one of those officers. I directed my team to switch on the Gold Command suite, which is next door to the control room, because it's easier to knock it down if it's proved not to be. Unarmed uniformed officers in the local area were being informed of the reports, but the clear message was given to them to not approach any suspect, to only feed back information, and that we would give a further update in relation to ARVs and dogs. So that was all going on then, and treating it, basically it was easier to ramp it up than come too late to it. So all the safeguards were being put in straight away until it was confirmed what it was.
So depending on the particular circumstances, and I appreciate that can change very quickly. We've heard that in Scotland, if you wish to deploy an ARV,
Yes.
you have to have the authority of the inspector, the duty inspector at
Yes,
ACR.
and that was the same as we had as well.
Right. And we've also heard from Mr. Graves that in London they don't need that authority because the ARVs are deployed. They're roaming around London all the time, ready to be sent to an incident.
Yes.
So they don't need that authority. But in Cumbria, you also needed
Yes,
authority.
the authority.
And for a situation where multiple calls come in, as we've described, and it's a grade 1 call, knife incident, I'd like to focus on what would be a reasonable officer response to that, bearing in mind the situation with the inspector in Scotland. We've heard two possible options, and I'd like your views on them. One, that an ARV is deployed immediately and then stood down if it's not needed within a short time. Alternatively, that contact is made with an ARV team. They are not deployed, but the inspector waits for feedback and further information. Do you think both of those are within the range of reasonable options?
They're both within the range of reasonable options. And just from our basis that we were running at the time was we erred on the side of caution and to deploy to a suspected, because then you could cancel them, because it might be several minutes and each minute counts if somebody's life's at risk. So, but either option could be a reasonable option.
Thank you. Are you able to indicate from your own experience or otherwise how common it is for ARVs to be deployed to a knife incident?
It's not. If you think about the proportion of incidents and the proportion of times you actually ask for them, it's not common in that respect. Likewise, asking for dogs, you know, certainly as operational officers or anywhere within the command structure, you know, in an ideal world you would have a dog attached to every shift and an ARV. But you know that they're in short supply, and so you have to be careful when you ask for them, because you don't want to take it to your incident and then leave officers at a more serious incident where it should have gone. So basically it's not common to keep having ARVs and dogs attend your incidents.
So it wouldn't be reasonable for anyone to be always deploying ARVs or dogs to
No,
every incident?
no.
And what circumstances would you consider where it would be reasonable to deploy an ARV and a dog unit?
Where you're thinking about either it's either a confirmed incident, so either confirmed physical firearm, confirmed physical weapon of high risk, or because of the volume of information coming in, it's likely to be confirmed, either of those. Because you might have, for example, someone with an imitation firearm, like an antique firearm or something, and a member of the public with good intention says they've seen someone with a gun, because they have seen someone with a gun, but it's an imitation or a model in some way, so it's not an illegal possession, but they did see someone with a gun. Or it's where you're balancing up that risk and thinking officers without taser still trying to deal with someone with a knife are at high risk of being stabbed or shot. And so you don't want to be deploying officers to those situations if you think that you have a safer option available to safeguard them. And so all the time you're thinking about, is it available? If it's not available because it's on a higher risk incident, then again, you're back to we're left with what we're left with. How can we make this safer? So all the time you're thinking about, if we're left with what we're left with, how can we do it safer to try and avoid no one being injured or killed?
But where an ARV is available, multiple calls on a Sunday morning, calls from separate members of the public, would a reasonable officer deploy an ARV straight away, or would they wait for feedback?
I think if they're content that it's a firearms or a suspected firearms based on the volume of information, I think the reasonable officer would authorise. But having never been that role, as an advisor, I would be advising that they erred on the side of caution, because it's easier to stand them down.
But ultimately it would be a matter for their...
It's for that
role.
ITFC to make that decision.
And in relation to deploying a dog unit, again in a situation where there's multiple calls on a Sunday morning, a knife incident, calls being made by separate members of the public, what would a reasonable officer do in relation to a dog unit?
So dogs can be deployed by controllers or supervisors. So there I would be expecting the dog to be deployed, because there's more than enough to with suspicion. If the dog's available, then you want the dog heading that way. And certainly if I was then on the ground as the patrol sergeant, I'd be thinking, I don't want to send myself and my staff in to a high-risk incident when I know there's a dog several minutes away who can go in first.
To what extent do you think a reasonable officer would wait or instruct the other officers wait for for the arrival of the dog if they're attending an incident in those circumstances?
I think there would be. I think the reasonable officer would tell the staff to hang back, because the safer option is the dog. So if the safer option is available, and at the minute, if we can do as the tactic of observing and seeing from a distance and seeing at the moment that no one else is in danger.
No member of the public.
Yeah, so if you can see that no member of the public is in imminent danger, you can keep your staff held back awaiting the dog. But then if a member of the public became in immediate danger, then you've got to review that decision.
So again, dependent on the circumstances you see at the scene.
Yes.
Can I ask about moving on from this situation, moving on to a scenario where the sergeant on the ground, who's in charge of the response team, makes a request for all units or an ARV and a dog unit, not just or. Again, in your experience, how common is it for a sergeant on the ground to make that request over the airwaves?
It's not common to ask for all of that, because you know that if you're constantly asking for it, it's like the boy who cried wolf scenario. You've got to be careful and mindful how often you're asking for it and when you're asking for it and justifying it. Because again, if you start getting these units deployed to you, you might be putting staff at serious risk in another policing area because you've taken that resource.
But making that request coming from the sergeant, is that within the range of options open to a sergeant?
So they can request it. Yes.
And in response to that request, what actions would you expect others to take in response to that?
I would expect in that line, if the sergeant has asked for this information, that then should be immediately considered by the control room, because at the end of the day, they're the only ones who can actually contact those resources and deploy them.
So if we've heard that in response to that, there was contact made with a dog unit to see whether they were available, that would be within the sort of reasonable range of things that you would expect to happen.
And plus then the control room takes primacy in relation to deployment. So the dog handler might say, well, I'm actually engaged on an incident here, but the control room inspector, for example, can then compare that incident with what they're asking for here and then take primacy and say, no, you're being deployed to this incident.
So again, in this scenario that we're discussing, you'd expect a reasonable inspector to be part of that consideration and that review.
Yes.
If that inspector wasn't available, who would you expect in the control room to be involved?
Well, the control room inspectors are designed. The role is designed to be immediately available, 24/7. So if they're not immediately available, you need to get them. So where are they? Because their deputy can't authorise to the same extent that the control room inspector is. So that's where you need, as a team and a function, to always have those available or readily available. And if the inspector isn't there, because they can't stay in the room all the time, so it's how quick can you get them, because they need involved in making that decision.
In light of a scenario where the sergeant on the ground has made this request, to what extent would you expect a reasonable member of staff in the control room to give weight to the sergeant's request?
I think it should be given a good level of weight.
Why do you say that?
On the grounds that it's not common practice for sergeants to constantly ask for these, and chances are they know information that the control room staff don't know. They know the information about the staff involved, they know the information potentially about the location, and especially now as all forces have gone to the area control room setup rather than station control rooms, you're relying on that local knowledge and that local command sergeant or inspector to understand a bit more about the team and the location, the risks.
So you would expect them to have more local knowledge of the area, but also to be know more about their team and the response
Yes,
team.
and so you don't ask for specialist resources lightly. So if a sergeant on the ground is saying we need this, then my advice would be you'd be looking for justification why not to give them it. And if the resource was available, you need to get them the resource.
We've heard evidence from Martin Graves. You've watched his evidence.
Yes.
And he was of the view that an inspector at the ACR, it would be within a reasonable inspector in that position, would be within their options to either deploy the ARV or to contact them and not deploy them, but wait for feedback. Do you agree with Martin Graves?
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Can you help us understand what difference it might make to officers on the ground if a sergeant makes that request and if the control room then deploy an ARV, arrange for a dog unit to attend, and the sergeant's requested all units? Can you explain what effect that might have on individual
It's a significant impact in relation to confidence and worry, because if you're going to an incident that you think is high risk, but you're aware that specialist resources and other resources are coming, then you know you've got more staff for dealing safer with an incident. But if you know that you are it, and you've still got this high risk incident, then you know that's going to impact on what tactical options you've got and what variations that you've got as well. And also for your own personal safety, you know then if you're it, you know that there's potentially a higher risk to your safety, rather than if you know there's colleagues, you know, either arriving with you or imminently behind.
Can I move on to the stay safe message? I'd like to, so taking this scenario that we're working through at the moment, where a stay safe message is sent, where the inspector in the control room goes onto the airwaves saying, I'm monitoring this obviously from a ARV perspective. If you get sightings of the male, you need to make an initial assessment yourself and feedback through straight away, and I'll listen out on the channel. Now, you've told us already about how you would see a stay safe message being communicated. So if we assume that a stay safe message along these lines has been communicated, to what extent do you think that communicates all that would be required in a stay safe message?
I think that it needs to be short, sharp, precise, no ambiguity in the message, and capable for the officers to hear. So short and snappy, key words, and clear about the mandate. So sometimes if you give officers that freedom of saying, like, make your own decision, decide this, does that mean they have to keep distance or they can interact with the person? So it's about clarity, like, do not approach, feedback first.
And earlier today, am I right in thinking you said the controller in the ACR can also give a stay safe message?
Yes.
That could be at an early stage?
Yes.
And in response to that type of message that I've just described, what would you expect a reasonable officer to give back to ACR in terms of feedback?
Definitely that they're approaching the scene or arriving at the scene, ideally approaching the scene and what they can first initially see. So is that one person, you know, one suspect, several suspects, any sight of weapons, any other factors of risk, so members of the public nearby or not. So it's some key principles like suspect sighted, you know, one person, no knife visible or knife visible, no members of the public in immediate vicinity, by the road, by, you know, whatever, but so just some key principal factors of what is making this a risk or not, higher risk or lower risk.
And is that something that officers are generally trained to do?
Yes.
And can that be provided at any point where they have access to their radio?
Yes, either through push and speak, or if need be, the red button, which turns your mic live.
We've heard evidence that there's something called an emergency button.
Yes.
I'm going to be moving on. I'm quite conscious we're a minute to one.
Well, that might be a good point to stop for lunch, and we'll sit at 2 o'clock.